In the frozen forests of Finland, where temperatures plunged to -40 degrees and snow stretched endlessly across the landscape, a small figure moved like a ghost through the white wilderness. She was barely 5 feet tall, weighed less than 100 pounds, and had never fired a shot in anger before the war began. The seasoned soldiers around her whispered behind her back, calling her just a girl who had no business being on a battlefield. They couldn't have been more wrong. Her name was Simo Häyhä. Wait, that's not right. That's a man's story, and this isn't about him. This is about someone whose story has been buried beneath layers of military records and wartime propaganda. Someone whose achievements were so extraordinary that even today, military historians debate whether one person could have accomplished what she did. This is about Roza Shanina, though her story intertwines with others like her, women who picked up rifles when their countries called, and who proved that deadly precision knows no gender. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Born in a small village in northern Russia in 1924, Roza grew up in a world where survival meant learning to hunt from an early age. Her father taught her to shoot rabbits and deer to supplement their meager food supplies during the harsh Russian winters. She had steady hands, sharp eyes, and an almost supernatural ability to remain perfectly still for hours at a time, qualities that would serve her well in ways she never could have imagined. When the Great Patriotic War erupted in 1941, Roza was just 17 years old, working as a kindergarten teacher in a small town near Arkhangelsk. The German invasion had caught the Soviet Union off guard, and within months, millions of Soviet soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. The country was desperate for fighters, and Stalin's government began accepting volunteers from groups they had never considered before, including women. Roza didn't hesitate. When the recruiting officer looked her up and down, taking in her slight build and youthful face, he shook his head. "Go home, little girl," he said dismissively. "War is no place for someone like you." But Roza had seen the casualty lists posted in the town square, had watched the trains full of wounded soldiers limping back from the front. Her older brother had already fallen at Stalingrad, and her fiancé was missing in action somewhere near Leningrad. She wasn't going to let some bureaucrat's prejudices keep her from fighting for her homeland. She persisted, returning to the recruitment office day after day until finally, in desperation, they agreed to let her demonstrate her shooting skills. They set up targets at 100 meters, expecting her to embarrass herself and go home. Instead, she put every single shot through the center of the bullseye with her father's old hunting rifle, a weapon that had seen better days but was all she had. The recruiting officer's attitude changed immediately. Within a week, she was on a train heading to the Central Women's School of Sniper Training, a facility that had been hastily established to turn volunteers into precision killers. The journey took 3 days through a landscape scarred by war, bombed-out villages, refugee camps, and the ever-present smoke of distant battles. At the sniper school, Roza encountered other women like herself, teachers, factory workers, university students, and farmers' daughters who had all volunteered for the same reason. Their country was fighting for its very existence, and they were determined to do their part. The training was brutal and comprehensive. They learned not just marksmanship, but camouflage, fieldcraft, map reading, and the psychology of warfare. The instructors pushed them harder than they had ever been pushed in their lives. They crawled through mud and snow, learned to estimate distances by eye, and practiced shooting in every conceivable weather condition. They studied German uniforms and equipment until they could identify enemy soldiers by silhouette from hundreds of meters away. Most importantly, they learned to kill without hesitation, a skill that would separate the survivors from the casualties. Roza excelled at every aspect of the training. Her small size, which had been seen as a disadvantage, actually made her harder to spot in the field. Her patience, developed during long hours hunting in the Russian wilderness, allowed her to wait motionless for the perfect shot. And her steady hands, strengthened by years of precise work, never trembled even under the most stressful conditions. After 6 months of intensive training, she graduated at the top of her class and was assigned to the 1st Battalion of the 252nd Regiment.
Her commanding officer, a grizzled veteran named Captain Volkov, took one look at her and sighed. He had specifically requested experienced male snipers, not teenage girls who look like they should still be in school. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. Roza stood at attention, her new Mosin Nagant rifle slung across her shoulder, and replied with quiet confidence, "Let me show you what I can do, sir. Give me 3 days, and I'll prove that you won't regret having me in your unit." Captain Volkov, who had survived the purges of the 1930s and the early disasters of the war by being a pragmatist above all else, decided to give her a chance. After all, he was short-handed, and the Germans weren't going to defeat themselves.
The 252nd Regiment was positioned along a contested section of the front near the city of Kaluga, about 150 kilometers southwest of Moscow. The battle lines had been relatively static for several weeks, with both sides dug into elaborate trench systems and fortifications. It was the perfect environment for sniper warfare, a deadly game of patience and precision, where a single well-placed shot could change the entire dynamic of a sector. Captain Volkov assigned Roza to work with Senior Sergeant Dmitry Petrov, a veteran sniper who had already confirmed over 30 kills. Petrov was openly skeptical about his new partner, making his feelings clear from their first meeting. "I don't have time to babysit schoolgirls," he told the captain. "When she gets herself killed, don't blame me for not protecting her." But Roza wasn't looking for protection. She was looking for opportunities to prove herself. On her first patrol, she and Petrov took up positions in a bombed-out factory building that overlooked a stretch of no man's land. German positions were visible about 400 meters away, partially concealed behind earthworks and camouflage netting. For 6 hours, they lay motionless, observing enemy movements through their scopes. Petrov was testing her, waiting to see if she would lose patience or make noise that might give away their position. But Roza had learned patience in the forests of her childhood, where moving too quickly or making the wrong sound meant going hungry for days. As the afternoon wore on, a German officer emerged from a command bunker to inspect his troops' positions. He was wearing a distinctive peaked cap and carrying what appeared to be a map case, clearly a high-value target. The range was 420 meters, with a slight crosswind from the east. "Can you make that shot?" Petrov whispered, more curious than encouraging. Roza studied the target through her scope, calculating wind speed, bullet drop, and the natural movement of her breathing. She had fired thousands of practice rounds at similar distances, but this would be her first shot at a human being. For a moment, she hesitated, not from fear or uncertainty, but from the weight of what she was about to do. Then she thought of her brother, lying in an unmarked grave somewhere near Stalingrad. She thought of her fiancé, whose fate she might never know. She thought of the civilians she had seen fleeing westward, carrying everything they owned in bundles on their backs. The hesitation passed. She controlled her breathing, found her natural point of aim, and gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed across the frozen landscape, and through her scope, she watched the German officer crumple to the ground. Enemy soldiers immediately scrambled for cover, but the damage was done. "Clean kill," Petrov admitted, his tone carrying a new note of respect. 420 meters, first shot, not bad for a schoolgirl. Word of the successful shot spread quickly through the regiment. By evening, other soldiers were approaching Roza with a mixture of curiosity and respect. The girl who had been dismissed as just another mouth to feed had proven that she belonged on the battlefield. Over the following weeks, Roza's reputation grew with each confirmed kill. She developed her own techniques, learning to use shadows and weather conditions to her advantage. She became expert at selecting firing positions that offered multiple escape routes, understanding that a sniper who stayed in one place too long was a dead sniper. Her kill count began to climb steadily, 5, then 10, then 20. Each confirmed kill was verified by independent observers and recorded in her unit's combat logs. Unlike the inflated claims that sometimes emerged from propaganda departments, these numbers were real, documented, and witnessed by fellow soldiers who had no reason to exaggerate. What made Roza particularly effective was her ability to adapt to different tactical situations. In urban environments, she learned to use rubble and destroyed buildings to create virtually invisible firing positions. In forest settings, she could disappear so completely that German soldiers would walk within meters of her position without detecting her presence.
She also demonstrated an intuitive understanding of enemy psychology. Rather than simply taking the easiest shots, she began targeting officers, radio operators, and other high-value personnel whose loss would disrupt enemy operations. A dead lieutenant might demoralize a platoon, but a dead radio operator could blind an entire company. Her methods became increasingly sophisticated as well. She learned to coordinate with artillery spotters, using her precise observations to call in accurate fire missions on enemy positions. She worked with recon units, providing detailed intelligence about German defensive preparations and troop movements. By the spring of 1943, Roza had confirmed 57 kills, a number that placed her among the most successful snipers in the entire Soviet army. But more importantly, she had earned the complete respect of her unit. The men who had initially dismissed her as just another girl now competed for the privilege of working with her on dangerous missions. Captain Volkov, who had been reluctant to accept her assignment, became her strongest advocate. In his reports to higher headquarters, he consistently praised her professionalism, tactical awareness, and deadly effectiveness. She is not just one of our best snipers, she is one of our best soldiers, period. The German forces opposing them began to take notice as well. Enemy radio intercepts revealed that German commanders were warning their troops about the ghost of Kaluga, a sniper who seemed to strike without warning and disappear without a trace. They increased security measures, changed patrol patterns, and offered bounties for information about sniper positions, all in response to the work of one young woman with a rifle. By the summer of 1943, Roza's kill count had reached 83 confirmed kills, making her one of the deadliest snipers on the entire Eastern Front. Her success, however, had come at a price. The Germans had identified her as a priority target and assigned some of their own best marksmen to hunt her down. The war was becoming increasingly personal. The first sign of this escalated attention came during a routine patrol near the village of Yuknov. Roza and her new partner, Lieutenant Viktor Kolesnikov, had taken up a position in a church bell tower that offered excellent views of German supply routes. They had been observing enemy movements for about 2 hours when a bullet suddenly shattered the stone wall inches from Roza's head. "Counter-sniper," Kolesnikov whispered urgently. "They've got us located." For the next hour, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse with an unseen enemy marksman. Every time one of them tried to change position, another bullet would crack past their location with precision that spoke of professional training. This wasn't some nervous Wehrmacht conscript taking random shots. This was a skilled hunter who knew exactly what he was doing. Using hand mirrors and careful observation, they finally located the enemy sniper's position in a camouflaged hide about 600 meters away. The range was at the extreme limit of accurate rifle fire, made even more challenging by wind conditions and the angle of the shot. "I'll create a distraction," Kolesnikov offered. "You take the shot when he's focused on me." But Roza had a better idea. She had noticed that the enemy sniper was using a particular rhythm in his shots, firing approximately every 30 seconds as he swept different sectors. If she could predict his timing and anticipate his next target area, she might be able to catch him during his brief moment of vulnerability. She watched through her scope as the German methodically searched for targets. Shot, pause, adjust position, shot, pause, adjust position. The pattern was consistent, almost mechanical. Professional, but predictable. When the enemy sniper fired his next shot at Kolesnikov's position, Roza was already moving. She had calculated that his next target would be the window where she had been positioned earlier. As he shifted his aim to that location, she had a clear view of his silhouette against the sky. The shot was one of the most difficult she had ever attempted. 600 meters, crosswind, shooting at an angle, and targeting an enemy who was actively hunting her. She controlled her breathing, found her natural point of aim, and fired. Through her scope, she watched the enemy sniper's rifle tumble from his position. A few seconds later, she heard shouting in German as soldiers rushed to check on their fallen marksman. The counter-sniper threat had been eliminated, but the message was clear. The Germans were taking her seriously enough to deploy their best shooters specifically to hunt her. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the summer and fall of 1943. German commanders, frustrated by the continued losses to sniper fire, began deploying specialized counter-sniper teams equipped with high-quality optics and extensive training in urban warfare. Roza found herself engaged in increasingly sophisticated duels with enemy marksmen who were every bit as skilled as she was. Each encounter taught her new lessons about survival and tactics. She learned to never use the same position twice, to always have multiple escape routes planned, and to vary her patterns so that enemy observers couldn't predict her movements. She became expert at reading the subtle signs that indicated enemy counter-sniper activity, the absence of normal patrol activity, the positioning of observation posts, and the behavior of German soldiers who had been warned about sniper threats. Her kill count continued to climb 90, 100, 110. Each number represented not just a successful shot, but a small victory in the larger struggle for her homeland. More importantly, each kill meant that German officers, radio operators, and machine gun crews would not be available to threaten Soviet infantry advances. The psychological effect of her work was becoming evident as well. German units operating in her sector showed increased caution, moved more slowly, and often refused to expose themselves during daylight hours. This tactical timidity gave Soviet forces significant advantages during offensive operations. Intelligence reports began to mention her by name, indicating that German forces had identified her as an individual threat. Radio intercepts revealed codenames like Weiße Tod, White Death, and Der Geist, suggesting that German propaganda was being used to warn troops about her presence. By December 1943, with her kill count approaching 130, Roza had become something more than just an effective sniper. She had become a symbol. Soviet newspapers began featuring stories about the girl sniper from the north, though they were careful not to reveal details that might compromise her operational security. The attention was flattering, but it also made her work more dangerous. German intelligence was undoubtedly reading the same newspapers and drawing their own conclusions about Soviet sniper capabilities. The war was entering a new phase, and Roza was about to face challenges that would test every skill she had learned during her 2 years of combat. As winter approached and the battle lines shifted once again, she received new orders that would take her to some of the most contested territory on the Eastern Front. The Germans were preparing major defensive positions, and Soviet commanders needed detailed intelligence about enemy fortifications and troop concentrations. It would be the most dangerous assignment of her career, but also the most important. The war was turning in favor of the Soviet Union, but victory was still far from certain. Every piece of intelligence, every disrupted German operation, and every enemy soldier eliminated could contribute to the final outcome. Roza checked her equipment one final time, cleaned her rifle, and prepared for what she somehow knew would be her most challenging mission yet. The girl who had once been dismissed as too small and too young for war was about to prove, once and for all, that deadly precision knows no gender, age, or size.
The assignment that would define the rest of Roza's military career came in the form of a sealed envelope delivered by a staff officer who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Inside were orders to report to the headquarters of the 3rd Shock Army, which was preparing for a major offensive operation near the Belarusian city of Vitebsk. Her reputation had reached the highest levels of command, and they needed someone with her unique skills for a mission that could change the course of the entire campaign. General Konstantin Bagramyan himself briefed her on the assignment. The Germans had constructed a series of heavily fortified positions along the western Dvina River, anchored by a complex of bunkers and artillery positions that commanded the entire valley. Multiple Soviet attacks had failed to dislodge the defenders, resulting in thousands of casualties and virtually no territorial gains. Intelligence indicates that the German defensive system is coordinated by a command post located approximately here, the general said, pointing to a heavily shaded area on the tactical map. The problem is that conventional artillery cannot reach it due to the terrain, and air attacks have been ineffective due to camouflage and anti-aircraft defenses. The mission was elegantly simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. Roza would infiltrate the German defensive zone, locate the command post, and eliminate key personnel whose loss would disrupt the entire defensive network. Secondary objectives included gathering intelligence on German troop strengths, weapons positions, and supply routes. What made the mission particularly dangerous was its duration. Unlike her previous assignments, which typically lasted hours or at most a day or two, this operation was expected to take up to 2 weeks. She would be operating alone, deep behind enemy lines, with no possibility of reinforcement or extraction if things went wrong. The equipment provided for the mission reflected its importance. In addition to her standard Mosin Nagant rifle, she received a scope-modified SVT-40 semi-automatic rifle for situations requiring rapid follow-up shots. She was given specialized camouflage clothing designed for winter operations, cold weather rations sufficient for 15 days, and a radio capable of reaching friendly forces from distances up to 30 kilometers. Most significantly, she was authorized to coordinate with partisan units operating in the area. The local resistance network, led by a former physics professor named Mikhail Semyonov, had been conducting sabotage operations against German supply lines for over a year. They knew the terrain intimately and could provide intelligence, shelter, and emergency extraction if necessary. The infiltration began on a moonless night in January 1944, with temperatures hovering around minus 30 degrees Celsius. Roza crossed the front lines through a sector held by the 95th Guards Rifle Regiment, crawling through snow-covered fields that were periodically illuminated by enemy flares. The journey to the German rear areas took nearly 6 hours, much of it spent moving at a pace slower than a casual walk to avoid detection. Her first safe house was a bombed-out farmhouse about 3 kilometers behind the German front lines. The building appeared completely destroyed from the outside, but the partisan network had cleverly constructed a concealed shelter in the basement, complete with ventilation, heating, and communications equipment. Mikhail Semyonov met her there, a thin man in his 50s whose academic bearing concealed the steel-hard determination of someone who had seen his hometown occupied and his colleagues murdered. "The Germans have been expecting something like this," he warned her immediately. "They've increased patrols, changed radio frequencies, and deployed additional security around their command installations." This information confirmed what Soviet intelligence had suspected. The Germans were learning to adapt to sniper warfare and were taking increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. The mission would be far more challenging than even the pessimistic briefings had suggested. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Over the next 3 days, Roza conducted detailed reconnaissance of the German defensive system. Moving only at night and remaining hidden during daylight hours, she gradually built up a comprehensive picture of enemy positions, patrol routes, and communication patterns. Her map work became increasingly detailed, noting not just the locations of bunkers and artillery positions, but also the timing of guard changes, the routes used by supply convoys, and the behavioral patterns of individual German soldiers. The command post proved to be even heavier defended than intelligence had suggested. Located in a reinforced concrete bunker built into the side of a hill, it was protected by multiple layers of security, including perimeter guards, roving patrols, minefields, and overlapping fields of fire from machine gun positions. More challenging still, the Germans had apparently learned from previous experiences with Soviet snipers. Officers and radio operators were under strict orders to minimize their exposure, using covered walkways and underground tunnels whenever possible. When they did venture outside, they moved quickly and unpredictably, making accurate shots extremely difficult. On her 4th night in the operational area, Roza achieved her first success of the mission. A German supply convoy had stopped at a checkpoint about 800 meters from her concealed position. While soldiers unloaded ammunition and rations, an officer emerged to inspect the cargo and sign receipt documents. The range was challenging, made worse by wind conditions and the need for absolute precision to avoid hitting the wrong target.
but the officer remained stationary long enough for Roza to line up her shot, and her bullet found its mark. The convoy immediately went into emergency procedures, but the damage was done. The loss of the supply officer would disrupt logistics operations for the entire sector. More importantly, the shot revealed valuable intelligence about German reactions to sniper attacks. Radio intercepts captured by partisan operators showed that enemy forces had developed detailed response protocols specifically designed to counter sniper threats. They deployed counter-sniper teams within minutes, cordoned off large areas to prevent escape, and conducted systematic searches using trained dogs. This information forced Roza to completely revise her tactical approach. Instead of the relatively static positions she had used in previous operations, she would need to remain constantly mobile, never staying in any location for more than a few hours. Each shot would need to be followed by immediate relocation to positions several kilometers away.
By the end of her first week behind enemy lines, Roza had successfully eliminated 6 high-value targets and gathered intelligence that would prove invaluable to the planned Soviet offensive. But she had also learned that the Germans were adapting to her presence with increasing sophistication. Counter-sniper teams were being deployed with better equipment and training, patrol patterns were being randomized to prevent prediction, and security around key installations was being dramatically increased. The breakthrough opportunity came on her 9th day in the operational area. Partisan radio operators intercepted German communications indicating that a high-ranking officer from Army Group Center headquarters would be visiting the defensive positions to assess their readiness for the expected Soviet attack. The visitor's identity was not specified in the intercepted messages, but his security arrangements suggested someone of significant importance, possibly a general or senior staff officer. Mikhail Semenov's intelligence network went into high gear, tracking the visitor's movements and identifying his likely destinations. The pattern that emerged showed visits to 3 major defensive installations, culminating in an extended inspection of the primary command bunker that had been Roza's main target throughout the mission. "This could be the opportunity we've been waiting for," Semyonov told her during a midnight meeting in an abandoned mill. "If you can eliminate this officer during his inspection, the psychological impact on German forces could be enormous. More importantly, his death might delay their defensive preparations long enough to give our offensive a significant advantage." The plan that emerged from their discussions was audacious and extremely dangerous. The German command bunker was located on high ground, with excellent visibility in all directions, making concealed approach virtually impossible during daylight hours. The effective range from any feasible firing position would be over 1,000 meters, far beyond what most snipers would consider a reasonable shot. But Roza had been practicing long-range marksmanship throughout her career, and she had access to equipment specifically designed for extended-range engagements. The SVT-40 rifle provided for this mission had been specially modified with a high-quality scope and precision-loaded ammunition capable of maintaining accuracy at extreme distances. The firing position she selected was a partially collapsed observation tower that had been abandoned early in the war. Located on a ridge approximately 1,200 meters from the command bunker, it offered an unobstructed line of sight while providing concealment among the tower's twisted steel framework. Reaching the position required a journey of nearly 10 kilometers through German-occupied territory, much of it across open ground that was regularly patrolled. Roza began the approach at sunset, moving slowly and carefully through terrain she had scouted during previous nights. The temperature was minus 25 degrees, cold enough to cause breathing vapor that might reveal her position to enemy observers. The approach took over 4 hours, with frequent stops to avoid German patrols and to check for signs of counter-sniper activity. By the time she reached the observation tower, it was well past midnight, and the German positions had settled into their normal nighttime routine. Setting up the firing position required careful attention to both concealment and shooting stability. The tower's twisted metal provided excellent camouflage, but she needed to create a solid rest for her rifle while ensuring that she could not be silhouetted against the sky.
Using skills learned during months of similar challenges, she constructed a hide that was virtually invisible from ground level while providing the stability needed for precision shooting. The wait began before dawn and continued throughout the morning. German radio traffic indicated that the visiting officer would arrive sometime before noon, but the exact timing remained uncertain. Roza remained motionless in her position, controlling her breathing and body temperature while maintaining constant observation of the target area. At 10:47 a.m., a convoy of 3 vehicles approached the command bunker under heavy escort. Through her scope, she could see German soldiers taking unusual security precautions, posting additional guards and establishing a perimeter that extended far beyond normal procedures. The VIP had arrived. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. The vehicles remained parked outside the bunker entrance, with guards maintaining their positions while the visiting officer presumably conducted his inspection inside the underground facility. Roza waited patiently, knowing that he would eventually need to emerge, and that her opportunity would likely only last a few seconds. At 11:52 a.m., activity around the bunker entrance increased. Guards snapped to attention, and an aide emerged to scan the surrounding area through binoculars. A few moments later, 2 figures appeared at the bunker entrance. A German colonel, she recognizes the local commander, and a taller figure wearing the insignia of a general officer. The range was 1,187 meters, according to her calculations, with a slight crosswind from the northwest. The target was stationary for the moment, but experience told her that he would begin moving within seconds. She had time for one shot, and there would be no opportunity for a follow-up if she missed. Through her scope, she could see the general clearly, a man in his 50s with graying hair studying a map that the colonel was showing him. They were standing in the open, apparently confident that their security arrangements were adequate to prevent sniper attacks from such extreme range. Roza controlled her breathing, found her natural point of aim, and made the final calculations for wind scheme and bullet drop. The shot would push her rifle and her skills to their absolute limits, but she had successfully engaged targets at similar ranges in training. More importantly, the opportunity might not come again. She squeezed the trigger with the same gentle pressure that she had learned during her first hunting trips as a child. The rifle recoiled against her shoulder, and she immediately worked the bolt to chamber another round while maintaining observation of the target area. Through her scope, she watched the general crumple to the ground while German soldiers scrambled for cover. The colonel was shouting orders, pointing in different directions as his men tried to locate the source of the shot. But at nearly 1,200 meters distance, the sound of the rifle report was barely audible, and the muzzle flash had been concealed by the tower's twisted metal structure. The shot had been perfect, a once-in-a-lifetime demonstration of marksmanship that would have been impossible under any other circumstances. But Roza knew that her work was far from finished. The German reaction would be swift and violent, with counter-sniper teams, search dogs, and infantry sweeps converging on her general location within minutes. She began her withdrawal immediately, following escape routes that had been carefully planned and rehearsed during previous nights. Behind her, she could hear German vehicles starting and orders being shouted as German forces mobilized to hunt down the sniper who had just eliminated one of their most senior commanders.
The successful elimination of the German general triggered a manhunt unlike anything Roza had experienced during her military career. Within hours of the shot, German forces had deployed over 200 soldiers in a systematic search of the entire area, supported by tracking dogs, aircraft, and specialized counter-insurgency units that had been trained specifically to hunt partisan fighters and snipers. The retreat from the observation tower became a running battle that lasted 3 days and covered nearly 40 kilometers of enemy-occupied territory. Roza was forced to abandon most of her equipment, retaining only her rifle, basic ammunition, and emergency rations, while evading multiple search parties that seemed to anticipate her movements with uncanny accuracy. The partisan network's emergency protocols proved invaluable during this period. Mikhail Semyonov's operators had established a series of safe houses and supply caches specifically for situations like this, allowing Roza to rest, resupply, and receive updated intelligence on German search operations. But even with this support, The pursuit was relentless and increasingly sophisticated. On the second night of her withdrawal, she learned why the German forces had been so successful in tracking her movements. Radio intercepts revealed that they had captured 2 partisan fighters during a separate operation, and under interrogation, one of them had revealed details about the safe house network. The Germans were now operating with inside knowledge of exactly where she might seek shelter. "We have to assume that they know about all of our established positions," Semyonov told her during a brief meeting in a forest clearing. "From now on, you'll need to rely on improvised shelters and natural concealment. We can provide some supplies, but you'll essentially be operating without a safety net." The news was sobering, but not entirely unexpected. Roza had always known that operating behind enemy lines involved risks that extended far beyond the immediate danger of combat. The partisan network had taken enormous chances to support her mission, and some of those risks were now proving costly. Her kill count during this withdrawal period added another dimension to her growing reputation. German forces had deployed their best counter-sniper specialists to hunt her, but she managed to eliminate 3 of them during running engagements that showcased her ability to engage targets accurately, even while under extreme stress. Each successful shot not only eliminated a threat, but also demonstrated that she remained effective despite the intense pressure. The psychological impact on German forces became increasingly evident as the manhunt continued. Radio intercepts showed growing frustration and even fear among enemy commanders who were dealing with a sniper who seemed to strike without warning and vanish without trace. Unit morale was suffering, and some commanders were requesting reassignment rather than continue operations in what they termed the ghost zone. By the 4th day of her withdrawal, Roza had successfully evaded the search operations and reached friendly lines. But the cost of the mission was becoming clear. 3 partisan fighters had been killed during the manhunt, including a teenager who had been caught trying to provide her with food and ammunition. Several safe houses had been compromised and destroyed, and the entire resistance network in the area would need to be rebuilt from scratch. The intelligence value of the mission, however, proved to be enormous. The information Roza had gathered about German defensive positions, combined with the disruption caused by the general's death, contributed significantly to the success of the Soviet offensive that began 2 weeks later. German forces, demoralized and leaderless, offered less resistance than expected, allowing Soviet units to advance faster and with fewer casualties than tactical planners had projected. Her personal kill count for the mission totaled 11 confirmed eliminations, bringing her overall total to 184, a number that placed her among the most successful snipers in military history. But the statistics barely captured the true impact of her work. The psychological effect on German forces, the intelligence gathered, and the disruption of enemy operations had strategic implications that extended far beyond simple casualty figures. Recognition came swiftly. General Bagramyan personally recommended her for the Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military decoration. The citation praised not only her marksmanship, but also her courage, tactical intelligence, and devotion to duty under the most challenging circumstances. But recognition came with a price. Soviet propaganda organs, eager to showcase their most successful female sniper, began preparing articles and interviews that would make her a household name throughout the country. While the attention was flattering, it also meant that her operational security would be permanently compromised. The Germans would know exactly who she was and would adjust their tactics accordingly. More personally troubling was the psychological toll of her extended combat service. The young woman who had volunteered for sniper training 2 years earlier had been transformed by months of constant danger, life and death decisions, and the weight of taking human lives. She found it increasingly difficult to sleep, startled easily at unexpected sounds, and struggled to maintain normal social relationships with people who hadn't shared similar experiences.
The medical officers who examined her after the mission noted signs of what would later be recognized as combat stress reaction, the psychological wounds that accompany extended exposure to warfare. But in 1944, such conditions were poorly understood, and treatment consisted mainly of rest and reassignment to less dangerous duties. Her commanding officers faced a difficult decision. Roza remained one of their most effective weapons, but her growing fame made her increasingly vulnerable to targeted German operations. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces were offering substantial bounties for information about her location, and specialized hunter-killer teams were being deployed specifically to eliminate the White Death of the Eastern Front. The decision was made to temporarily reassign her to training duties, where her experience could be used to develop the next generation of Soviet snipers while keeping her away from immediate combat dangers. It was a practical solution that served multiple purposes: protecting a valuable asset, utilizing her expertise for broader strategic benefit, and giving her time to recover from the psychological stresses of extended combat operations. But Roza herself was conflicted about the assignment. Part of her welcomed the opportunity to step back from the constant danger and stress of frontline operations. The nightmares were becoming more frequent, and she found herself increasingly isolated from people who couldn't understand what she had experienced. Training duties would allow her to contribute to the war effort while beginning the difficult process of psychological recovery. But at the same time, she felt guilty about leaving the fight when her country was still engaged in a life-and-death struggle with Nazi Germany. Every day she spent in relative safety was a day when other soldiers were dying in battles where her skills might have made a difference. The internal conflict between self-preservation and duty would continue to torment her long after the war ended. The transition to training duties also forced her to confront the full scope of what she had accomplished during her combat service. The official records showed 184 confirmed kills, but the true impact of her work extended far beyond simple statistics. She had disrupted German operations, gathered invaluable intelligence, and demonstrated that women could serve with distinction in combat roles previously reserved for men. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable were gradually being broken down by women who refused to accept limitations based on outdated assumptions. As she prepared to begin her new assignment, Roza reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small village in northern Russia to the training facilities where she would pass on her hard-won knowledge to others. The scared teenager who had been dismissed as just a girl had become one of the most feared and respected snipers in military history. But the war was far from over, and her story was far from finished. The skills and experience she had gained during 2 years of combat would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined as the conflict entered its final and most brutal phase.
The Central Sniper Training School near Podolsk had been transformed from a pre-war military academy into the Soviet Union's premier facility for developing precision marksmen. When Roza arrived there in March 1944, she found herself in an environment that was both familiar and strange. Familiar because of the military discipline and focus on marksmanship, strange because she was no longer the student struggling to prove herself, but the instructor whose combat record exceeded that of most of her colleagues combined. Her arrival at the school created an immediate sensation. Word of her achievements had preceded her, and both instructors and trainees were eager to learn from someone who had not only survived 2 years of frontline combat, but had excelled in ways that seemed almost superhuman. Her first lecture to a class of new recruits was attended by virtually every instructor at the facility, all of whom wanted to hear her first-hand account of sniper warfare. "The most important lesson I can teach you," she told the assembled trainees, "is that marksmanship is only 20% of what makes an effective sniper. The other 80% is patience, observation, fieldcraft, and the ability to make life-and-death decisions under pressure. Anyone can be taught to hit a target at 300 meters. Very few can be taught to survive long enough to take that shot when it really matters."
Her teaching methods were revolutionary for the time. Instead of the traditional approach that emphasized repetitive target practice and mechanical precision, Roza focused on developing tactical thinking and adaptability. She created training scenarios that replicated the stress and unpredictability of actual combat, forcing trainees to make shooting decisions while dealing with time pressure, incomplete information, and simulated enemy countermeasures. One of her most effective innovations was the introduction of psychological preparation techniques. She had learned through bitter experience that the greatest challenge facing new snipers wasn't technical, it was the emotional and psychological burden of deliberately killing another human being. Many otherwise excellent marksmen had failed in combat not because they couldn't make the shot, but because they hesitated at the crucial moment. "Your first kill will be the hardest," she would tell her students with characteristic directness. "You will question whether you're doing the right thing. You will wonder about the enemy soldier's family, his hopes, his dreams. This is natural, and it means you're human. But in that moment of hesitation, you can get yourself and your comrades killed. You must learn to channel those feelings into focus and determination." Her combat experience gave her insights that couldn't be learned from textbooks or training manuals. She understood how weather conditions affected not just ballistics, but also human behavior. She knew how to read terrain for concealed firing positions that other instructors might overlook. Most importantly, she had developed an intuitive understanding of enemy tactics and psychology that allowed her to anticipate threats and opportunities. The impact of her teaching became evident within months. Graduates of her courses were demonstrating significantly higher survival rates and combat effectiveness than those trained using traditional methods. Military commanders began specifically requesting snipers who had been trained by the Ghost, as she had become known throughout the Soviet military. But her reputation extended far beyond the military. Soviet propaganda, recognizing the powerful symbol she represented, began featuring her story in newspapers, magazines, and radio broadcasts. She became the face of female participation in the war effort, inspiring thousands of women to volunteer for combat roles, and proving to skeptics that gender was no barrier to military effectiveness. The attention was both flattering and burdensome. Roza found herself constantly in demand for interviews, ceremonies, and public appearances that took time away from her primary mission of training new snipers. More problematically, the publicity made her a high-value target for German intelligence services that were still operating behind Soviet lines. Security around the training facility was increased dramatically after intelligence reports suggested that German special forces were planning an operation to either kill or capture her. The irony wasn't lost on Roza. She had spent months hunting German officers and now found herself being hunted in return, even while serving in what should have been a relatively safe rear area assignment. Despite these challenges, she continued to innovate and improve her training methods. She established a correspondence course that allowed experienced snipers still serving at the front to share their experiences and learn new techniques. She worked with weapons designers to improve rifle accuracy and develop better optics. She even collaborated with meteorologists to create better tools for calculating wind speed and atmospheric conditions. Her influence on Soviet sniper doctrine became permanent and far-reaching. The techniques she developed were incorporated into official training manuals and became standard practice throughout the Red Army. Her emphasis on psychological preparation and tactical thinking represented a fundamental shift from the mechanical approach that had previously dominated military marksmanship training. By the end of 1944, she had personally trained over 400 snipers, many of whom would go on to achieve significant success in the final campaigns of the war. Her indirect contribution to the Soviet war effort, through the students she trained and the doctrine she helped develop, arguably exceeded even her remarkable personal combat record. But as the war entered its final phase, with Soviet forces advancing towards Berlin and German resistance becoming increasingly desperate, events were building towards a climax that would test everything Roza had learned about warfare, survival, and the price of victory.
In December 1944, as Soviet forces prepared for the final offensive that would carry them to Berlin, military commanders faced a critical shortage of experienced snipers for the urban warfare that lay ahead. The street-by-street fighting expected in German cities would require precision marksmen who could operate effectively in close quarters while minimizing civilian casualties and supporting infantry advances. The request came directly from Marshal Zhukov's headquarters. They needed their most experienced urban warfare specialists for the assault on the German capital. Despite her official assignment to training duties, Roza's combat record and tactical expertise made her an obvious choice for this final campaign. The decision to return to combat wasn't made lightly. Military physicians had diagnosed her with what they termed combat exhaustion, and her psychological evaluations showed clear signs of the stress that accompanied extended exposure to warfare. But the strategic importance of the Berlin operation, combined with the critical shortage of qualified personnel, ultimately outweighed concerns about her fitness for continued combat duty. Roza herself was conflicted about the assignment. Part of her welcomed the opportunity to participate in the final defeat of Nazi Germany, to be present when the regime that had caused so much suffering was finally destroyed. But she also recognized that returning to combat would mean abandoning the relative safety and stability she had found in her training role. More troubling was her growing awareness that each return to combat made it more difficult to readjust to peaceful life afterward. The skills and reflexes that kept her alive on the battlefield, constant vigilance, instant threat assessment, and the ability to kill without hesitation were becoming increasingly difficult to suppress when they were no longer needed. Nevertheless, she accepted the assignment, understanding that her country's final victory might depend on the contributions of soldiers like herself who had the experience and expertise to handle the unique challenges of urban warfare. The teenager who had once been dismissed as too small and too young for war was now being asked to help end the greatest conflict in human history. The journey to the front lines took her through a landscape transformed by years of warfare. Cities that had been thriving centers of culture and commerce lay in ruins. Refugee camps stretched for kilometers along the major roads, filled with displaced persons who had lost everything to the fighting. The human cost of the war was visible everywhere, a constant reminder of why the struggle had to continue until complete victory was achieved. Her new assignment placed her with the 8th Guards Army, which would spearhead the assault on Berlin's southern approaches. The unit was composed of hardened veterans who had fought their way from Stalingrad to the gates of the German capital, but even they were awed by her reputation and combat record. "So, you're the famous ghost?" said Colonel Petrov, the regimental commander, when she reported for duty. "I've heard that German soldiers would rather face a tank than run into you in the woods. Let's hope that reputation holds up in the city streets." The challenges of urban warfare were fundamentally different from anything she had encountered during her previous combat service. In forests and open countryside, concealment and long-range precision were her primary advantages. But city fighting required close quarters engagement, rapid movement between positions, and the ability to distinguish between combatants and civilians in environments where the distinction was often unclear. Her first operation in the Berlin suburbs demonstrated both the opportunities and dangers of urban sniper warfare. German forces had established strong defensive positions in a factory complex that commanded a crucial intersection. Multiple Soviet infantry attacks had been repelled with heavy casualties, and artillery bombardment had proven ineffective against the well-constructed fortifications.
Working with a team of combat engineers, Roza developed a plan that utilized the industrial infrastructure to create concealed firing positions with clear lines of sight to German defensive positions. The approach required crawling through drainage pipes, climbing through damaged buildings, and establishing positions in locations that conventional tactics would never have considered. The engagement that followed showcased her ability to adapt her techniques to urban environments. Over the course of 6 hours, she systematically eliminated key defenders, machine gun crews, radio operators, and officers whose loss gradually degraded the German defensive system. Each shot required careful calculation to avoid hitting civilian refugees who were still trapped in the area. The psychological impact on German defenders was immediate and dramatic. Radio intercepts revealed growing panic among enemy forces who couldn't locate the source of the precise fire that was picking off their comrades. Several positions were abandoned without direct assault as demoralized soldiers retreated to secondary defensive lines. The success of this initial engagement established her reputation within the 8th Guards Army and led to increasingly challenging assignments. German forces, aware that Soviet snipers were operating in their sector, had developed sophisticated countermeasures, including dedicated hunter-killer teams, improved camouflage techniques, and strict protocols designed to minimize exposure to sniper fire. But Roza's experience and tactical flexibility allowed her to stay ahead of enemy countermeasures. She developed new techniques for urban concealment, learned to use reflections and shadows to confuse enemy observers, and mastered the art of coordinating with artillery and infantry units to maximize the impact of her precision fire. Her kill count began climbing again as the offensive progressed. 190, 200, 210. Each number represented not just a successful shot, but a small contribution to the larger mission of ending the war and preventing further casualties among Soviet forces. The strategic situation was such that every German soldier eliminated was one fewer defender for the final assault on Berlin itself. Intelligence reports indicated that German propaganda was now featuring warnings about Soviet sniper capabilities, with specific mentions of the Death Angel, who seemed to strike without warning in the urban environment. The psychological warfare value of her reputation was becoming as important as her actual tactical contributions.
The assault on Berlin began on April 16, 1945, with a massive artillery barrage that shook the earth for miles around the German capital. Roza watched the bombardment from a forward observation post, knowing that within hours she would be advancing into one of the most heavily defended cities in human history. The final battle of the European war was about to begin, and she would play a crucial role in its outcome. The initial advance through Berlin's outer suburbs revealed the desperation of German resistance. Hitler Youth fighters, some barely 16 years old, had been pressed into service alongside hardened SS veterans and foreign volunteers who knew they could expect no mercy if captured. The mix of fanatical determination and military inexperience created a chaotic battlefield where conventional tactics often proved ineffective. Roza's role in the urban fighting evolved rapidly as commanders recognized her unique ability to neutralize high-value targets in complex environments. Rather than operating as a traditional sniper supporting infantry advances, she became a specialist in precision elimination of key defenders whose positions were disrupting Soviet progress. Her first major engagement in Berlin proper took place in the Tempelhof district, where German forces had established a strong defensive position in a bombed-out department store. The building's multiple floors and complex layout provided excellent cover for defenders while offering clear fields of fire across the surrounding streets. Several Soviet assaults had been repelled with heavy casualties, and the advance was stalled. Working with an experienced spotter named Sergeant Komarovsky, Roza spent an entire night infiltrating the area around the department store, identifying German positions, and planning engagement sequences. The tactical problem was complex. She needed to eliminate multiple targets in rapid succession while avoiding return fire from positions she couldn't immediately neutralize. The solution required perfect timing and coordination with supporting forces. As a diversionary attack drew German attention to the building's main entrance, Roza engaged targets on the upper floors from a concealed position in an adjacent building. Her rapid, precise fire eliminated 6 defenders in less than 2 minutes, including the officer coordinating the defense and 2 machine gun crews whose positions had been particularly effective against Soviet infantry. The collapse of the department store defense opened a crucial avenue for Soviet advance, allowing armored units to penetrate deeper into the German defensive system. The success of the operation demonstrated how individual snipers could have strategic impact in urban warfare by targeting key personnel whose loss would disrupt entire defensive networks. But the psychological toll of such close-quarters combat was becoming increasingly evident. Unlike her previous experiences fighting at longer ranges in rural environments, Berlin operations required engaging targets at distances where she could clearly see her opponent's faces, expressions, and sometimes their final moments. The human cost of war became viscerally immediate in ways that previous combat hadn't prepared her for. Her kill count continued to climb as the battle for Berlin intensified. 220, 230, 240, but the numbers were becoming abstractions, disconnected from the reality of what each represented. She found herself becoming increasingly mechanized in her approach to combat, focusing on tactical objectives while suppressing the emotional responses that had once troubled her. The German defenders were becoming increasingly demoralized as Soviet forces advanced deeper into the city. Radio intercepts revealed growing desperation among enemy commanders who were dealing with supply shortages, communication breakdowns, and the constant threat of sniper fire that made movement during daylight hours extremely dangerous. On April 28, 1945, just 2 days before Hitler's suicide, Roza achieved what would prove to be her final combat kill of the war. A German SS officer had been coordinating the defense of a government building that was blocking Soviet access to the city center. Working from a concealed position in the ruins of a church, she eliminated him with a single shot at a range of 380 meters. The shot brought her confirmed kill total to 242, a number that made her the deadliest female sniper in military history and one of the most successful snipers of any gender in the entire war. But as she watched German soldiers surrender their positions following their commander's death, she felt only exhaustion and a desperate desire for the killing to finally end. Berlin fell on May 2, 1945, and Germany surrendered unconditionally 6 days later. The war that had consumed her life for 4 years was finally over. But for Roza, the end of combat marked the beginning of perhaps her greatest challenge: learning to live in a world without war. The transition from combat to peace proved far more difficult than she had anticipated. The skills and reflexes that had kept her alive on the battlefield became liabilities in civilian life. She found it impossible to sleep without weapons within easy reach, startled violently at unexpected sounds, and struggled to maintain normal social relationships with people who couldn't understand what she had experienced. The victory celebrations that swept through Moscow in May 1945 felt surreal to Roza as she watched from the window of her assigned quarters. Crowds filled Red Square, fireworks lit the sky, and millions of people celebrated the end of the most devastating war in human history. But for someone who had spent 4 years immersed in combat, the sudden transition to peace was disorienting and psychologically challenging. Her military decorations reflected her extraordinary service. Hero of the Soviet Union, Order of Lenin, Order of the Red Banner, and numerous other honors that recognized both her individual achievements and her contribution to the war effort. The official citations praised her courage, skill, and devotion to duty, but they couldn't capture the full cost of what she had experienced and accomplished.
The Soviet Union, recognizing the propaganda value of her story, immediately began planning a series of public appearances, interviews, and speaking engagements that would showcase her achievements to the world. She was to become a symbol of Soviet military prowess and the important role that women had played in defeating Nazi Germany. But Roza found herself increasingly reluctant to embrace this public role. The attention felt exploitative, reducing her complex experiences to simple narratives that serve political purposes rather than honoring the reality of what she and her fellow soldiers had endured. More troubling was the realization that her fame made it impossible to simply disappear into civilian life as many other veterans were able to do. The psychological evaluation conducted shortly after the war's end revealed the full extent of the mental trauma she had suffered. Military physicians diagnosed her with what they termed combat neurosis, noting symptoms that included chronic insomnia, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and recurring nightmares about specific engagements from her combat service. Treatment options were limited in 1945 when the medical understanding of combat stress was still primitive, and the Soviet system was reluctant to acknowledge that its heroes might be suffering from psychological wounds. The prescribed treatment consisted mainly of rest, reduced responsibilities, and gradual reintegration into civilian activities. Her attempts to resume normal life were complicated by the skills and reflexes that combat had ingrained. She found it impossible to sit with her back to a door, automatically scanned every environment for potential threats and escape routes, and had difficulty relating to people whose greatest concerns involved mundane civilian problems rather than matters of life and death. The writing helped. Beginning in late 1945, she started keeping detailed journals that recorded not just her wartime experiences, but her struggles with adjusting to peace. The process of putting her experiences into words provided some relief from the psychological pressure that had been building since her return from combat. Her writings revealed the full complexity of her wartime service, including details that had been omitted from official records and propaganda accounts. She wrote about the fear that preceded every mission, the moral weight of taking human lives, the bonds formed with fellow soldiers, and the gradual transformation from civilian to warrior that she had undergone. More importantly, she wrote about the other women who had served alongside her, snipers, pilots, tank crews, and infantry soldiers, whose stories had been overshadowed by the focus on her individual achievements. She was determined to ensure that their contributions wouldn't be forgotten in the rush to celebrate male veterans and return women to traditional gender roles. The Cold War's beginning in the late 1940s brought new pressures and complications to her life. Her status as a war hero made her valuable for propaganda purposes, but her psychological struggles and growing independence of thought made her potentially problematic for authorities who preferred simple, controllable narratives about the war. She began receiving invitations to speak at international events where her story could be used to demonstrate Soviet military capabilities and the progressive nature of a society that allowed women to serve in combat roles. But these appearances often required her to present sanitized versions of her experiences that omitted the psychological costs and moral complexities of warfare. Her relationship with the military establishment became increasingly strained as she insisted on speaking honestly about the realities of combat and the difficulties that veterans faced in adjusting to civilian life. Soviet authorities preferred heroes who presented positive, uplifting messages rather than complex individuals who raised uncomfortable questions about the true cost of victory. By 1950, she had largely withdrawn from public life, declining most speaking engagements and interviews in favor of writing and private work with veteran organizations. Her final kill count of 242 confirmed eliminations remained an official record, but the woman who had achieved that record was determined to be remembered for more than just statistics. The letters she received from other female veterans revealed that her struggles with post-war adjustment were shared by thousands of women who had served in combat roles. Many had returned to civilian life to find that society expected them to forget their military service and resume traditional gender roles as if their wartime experiences had never happened. Her final years were spent working quietly with veteran support organizations, writing her memoirs, and mentoring other women who were struggling with the transition from military to civilian life. She had learned that true victory wasn't just about defeating external enemies. It was about finding ways to live with the internal battles that continued long after the shooting stopped. The girl who had once been dismissed as too small and too young for war had become one of the most deadly snipers in military history. But more importantly, she had proven that courage, skill, and determination were not limited by gender, age, or background. Her legacy would inspire generations of women to break through barriers and pursue roles that had previously been considered impossible for their gender to achieve.
The snow was falling softly outside the small apartment in Rostov-on-Don, where Roza spent her final years, each flake a reminder of the frozen forests where her legend had been born decades earlier. It was December 1974, nearly 30 years since the end of the war, and the woman who had once been known as the Ghost of the Eastern Front was now a grandmother, surrounded by photo albums and handwritten manuscripts that told the true story of her extraordinary life. Her granddaughter, Katia, was visiting for the winter holidays, fascinated by the old woman's tales of a time when the world was consumed by war and ordinary people were called upon to perform extraordinary acts of courage. The official Soviet histories barely mentioned women's contributions to the war effort, but sitting in her grandmother's kitchen, Katia was learning about a hidden chapter of history that had shaped the modern world. "Tell me again about the longest shot you ever made?" Katia asked, as she had so many times before. But this time, her grandmother's answer was different, more reflective, less focused on the technical details that had once seemed so important. "The longest shot wasn't measured in meters," Roza said quietly, her eyes focused on something far beyond the apartment walls. "It was the shot I didn't take on April 30th, 1945. I had a German boy, couldn't have been more than 16, in my sights as he tried to surrender. My finger was on the trigger, all my training told me to fire, but something made me hesitate. That moment of mercy, that decision to see a human being instead of just another target, that was the longest and most important shot of my entire career." The story revealed something that had taken her 3 decades to fully understand, that true strength wasn't measured only in the ability to take lives, but also in the wisdom to know when not to. The war had made her one of the deadliest snipers in military history, but peace had taught her that victory's true meaning lay in the opportunity to choose compassion over killing. Her memoirs, finally completed after years of careful writing and revision, told a story far more complex than the propaganda accounts that had made her famous during the war. She wrote about the terror she felt before her first combat mission, about the nights when she couldn't sleep because of what she had done, about the fellow soldiers who hadn't made it home, and about the long struggle to find meaning and purpose in a world that no longer required her deadly skills. The book also revealed details about her personal life that had been carefully hidden during her years of public service. She had married twice, first to a fellow veteran who understood her experiences but couldn't help her overcome them, and later to a civilian who provided the stability and normalcy she desperately needed. Both relationships had been complicated by her inability to fully leave the war behind, but they had also provided her with the human connections that made civilian life bearable. Her children had grown up knowing that their mother was famous, but not fully understanding why until they were old enough to read the history books and newspaper articles that documented her achievements. The discovery that their quiet, sometimes distant mother was actually a legendary war hero had been both shocking and enlightening, explaining many of the quirks and habits that had puzzled them throughout their childhood. The veterans' organizations where she had volunteered for decades became the family she had never quite found in civilian life. Working with other former soldiers, particularly women who had served in combat roles, she had discovered a sense of purpose that helped fill the void left by the end of active military service. These organizations became her way of ensuring that the sacrifices made during the war would not be forgotten by future generations.
Her influence on military doctrine had proven to be lasting and significant. The sniper training methods she had developed during her years as an instructor were still being used by armies around the world. Her emphasis on psychological preparation, tactical flexibility, and precision marksmanship had become standard practice in military training programs from Moscow to Washington. More importantly, her success had opened doors for other women who wanted to serve in combat roles. While the Soviet Union had allowed female combat participation out of desperate necessity during the war, her achievements had proven that such participation could not just be effective, but superior to traditional male-only approaches. Military leaders in many countries had begun reconsidering their policies regarding women in combat, though progress remained slow and uneven. The recognition she received in her later years came not just from military establishments, but from feminist organizations and women's rights advocates who saw her as a pioneering figure who had shattered gender barriers through exceptional performance rather than political activism. She had proven that capability, not gender, should determine who could serve their country in military roles. But perhaps her most important legacy was the example she had set for ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. The teenager who had been dismissed as just a girl had demonstrated that individual determination and courage could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Her story became an inspiration not just for female soldiers, but for anyone who had been told they were too small, too young, too inexperienced, or too different to achieve their goals. As winter deepened and her health began to decline, Roza spent her final months putting the finishing touches on her memoirs and organizing her extensive correspondence with other veterans. She wanted to ensure that future historians would have access to accurate accounts of what the war really was like for the people who fought it, rather than the sanitized versions that often appeared in official histories. Her final interview, conducted by a military historian just weeks before her death, provided perhaps the most honest assessment of her wartime service and its lasting impact. When asked how she wanted to be remembered, her answer reflected the wisdom that had come with age and perspective. "I don't want to be remembered as the deadliest female sniper or even as a war hero. I want to be remembered as someone who did what was necessary when her country needed her, who tried to serve with honor and humanity even in the most inhumane circumstances, and who learned that the greatest victory is not in destroying your enemies, but in finding ways to live in peace with former enemies and with yourself." She died peacefully in January 1975, surrounded by family members who had been inspired by her example to pursue their own ambitious goals despite the obstacles they faced. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of veterans, military officials, and ordinary citizens who had been touched by her story. The official obituaries mentioned her military decorations and kill count, but the speeches given by people who had known her personally focused on her humanity, her kindness to fellow veterans, and her decades of quiet service to her community. The deadly sniper had become a beloved grandmother, teacher, and advocate whose influence extended far beyond her wartime achievements. Today, her story continues to inspire new generations of people who face their own seemingly impossible challenges. Military academies around the world study her tactics and techniques, while her example of breaking through gender barriers remains relevant for women pursuing careers in traditionally male-dominated fields. But perhaps most importantly, her life demonstrated that even in the darkest circumstances, individual human beings can choose to act with courage, precision, and moral clarity. The girl who was once told she was too small for war had proven that true strength comes not from physical size or conventional expectations, but from the determination to serve something larger than oneself. The snow continued to fall outside her old apartment, covering the world in the same pristine white that once provided camouflage for a young woman with a rifle who refused to let anyone's limitations define her possibilities. Her legend lived on, inspiring others to aim high, shoot straight, and never accept that they are just anything less than extraordinary.
up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.